The quiet evening in Ben's small apartment was shattered by an unexpected knock. Startled, he looked up from his book, noticing the room was now only illuminated by the soft yellow light reflecting off the silent walls. It was almost 10 p.m., far too late for someone to drop by unannounced. Ben frowned, quickly running through the names of people who might be at the door. His friends weren't the type to show up without warning, especially at this hour. An odd feeling crept into his chest, a mix of curiosity and a touch of unease. Who could be visiting at this time? Moving slowly toward the door, he took a deep breath before peering through the peephole. Contrary to all his guesses, the person outside wasn't an acquaintance, but a police officer. The man had a stern demeanor, with a neat, short haircut and sharp but not cold eyes. There was something about him that Ben couldn't look away from. His heart skipped a beat, and Ben opened the door, cautiously but without hiding his curiosity. "Good evening," a deep, warm voice said. "I'm Officer Daniel Tate. Are you Ben Hart?" Ben nodded, feeling a little flustered. "Yes, that's me. Is there a problem?" Daniel smiled faintly, his eyes taking in the scene behind Ben before answering. "Just a routine check. May I come in?" Ben hesitated slightly at the officer's request. The thought of a cop wanting to come inside at this hour made him feel uneasy. But Daniel's eyes, calm, controlled, yet hiding something hard to decipher, made him nod almost reflexively. He stepped back, gesturing for Daniel to enter. As the door closed behind them, Ben couldn't help but notice how Daniel quietly surveyed his apartment. His eyes scanned every small detail, the neatly arranged bookshelves, the desk with the computer still on, the half-finished cup of coffee on the kitchen counter. It didn't feel like a typical check. "Is something wrong?" Ben asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Daniel turned to look at him, his lips curving into a slight smile. But he didn't answer immediately. "Nothing too serious," he said. "There have been a few reports of suspicious activity in the area lately. I wanted to see if you've noticed anything unusual." Ben frowned, shaking his head. "I haven't seen anything. It's pretty quiet here." "Quiet can be a good thing." Daniel nodded. "But sometimes, it can hide more than we think." The way he said that sent a shiver down Ben's spine. Not out of fear, but because of the implication in Daniel's words, as if he wasn't just talking about the neighborhood, but about Ben himself. The air in the room felt strangely thick. Ben sensed Daniel's gaze lingering on him longer than necessary, as if he were analyzing him, probing him, or maybe something else, something Ben wasn't sure he dared to name. He blinked, trying to break the strange feeling with a light smile. "Do you usually drop by apartments at this hour? Or am I a special case?" Daniel raised an eyebrow, then chuckled softly. "I can't say I do this with everyone." Another statement loaded with hidden meaning. Ben felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't understand why, but there was something about Daniel that made him feel both tense and drawn in. Ben crossed his arms, trying to maintain a relaxed tone. "So, besides checking out the neighborhood, what's interesting about your job?" Daniel leaned casually against the kitchen counter, his posture relaxed but his eyes still fixed on Ben. "I doubt it's as interesting as creating art," he replied, "but it has its own kind of surprise. No 2 days are the same." Ben nodded. He could imagine that. Daniel's job certainly wasn't like sitting in front of a computer screen for hours designing. It was a different world, a world he wasn't familiar with, but found strangely appealing. "Do you like your job?" Ben asked. Daniel was silent for a moment before answering. "Some days I do, some days I don't," he shrugged, "but it makes me feel like I have a purpose." That statement echoed in Ben's mind longer than he expected. A purpose. That's how he used to feel about his work. But lately, he wasn't so sure anymore. Without realizing it, Ben noticed that Daniel was looking at him differently, as if he were reading his thoughts. "What about you?" Daniel asked, his voice deeper. "Do you like what you do?" Ben swallowed hard, unsure where this line of questioning was going. "I think so, but like you, there are days when I'm not so sure anymore." Daniel nodded, as if he understood that feeling perfectly. A comfortable silence settled between them, no longer tense, but a quiet connection, as if they had just found a common ground between two different worlds. But just when Ben started to feel more at ease, Daniel abruptly changed the atmosphere. "Do you ever feel unsafe when you're alone?" Ben frowned. "Not really. I like the quiet." Daniel smiled faintly, but didn't entirely drop the subject. "Quiet is good, but sometimes, That's when the unexpected happens. This time, Ben couldn't ignore the way Daniel's voice had lowered, carrying a distinct sense of mystery. He felt like he was being drawn into an unspoken game, a game where Daniel was leading. And Ben was slowly following without realizing it. "What are you trying to imply, Officer Tate?" Ben asked, trying to keep his voice light but unable to hide his curiosity. Daniel looked at him for a moment, then smiled. "Just a reminder, sometimes, we don't realize what's right in front of us until someone else points it out." Ben opened his mouth to ask more, but realized there was nothing to say. Daniel's words were enough to leave a mark in his mind, a mark he wasn't sure he could erase. The air in the small apartment was shifting, and Ben knew that, from the moment Daniel stepped through the door, things would never be quite the same again. A few days later, Ben still couldn't get Daniel out of his head. The previous conversation had left him with a strange feeling, not exactly anxiety, but not entirely comfortable either. The way Daniel looked at him, the subtle innuendos, it all made him feel like something was unfinished. Then, one night, a knock echoed once more. Ben got up, his heart beating faster as he walked toward the door. This time, when he looked through the peephole, he didn't see a police officer in uniform. Daniel was standing there, dressed in casual clothes, a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Simple jeans, no sternness or official air, just a normal man looking somewhat hesitant. Ben opened the door, trying to keep his voice calm. "Daniel?" Daniel smiled slightly, a somewhat uncertain smile. "Hey, I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd see if you were home." Ben raised an eyebrow. "In the neighborhood?" He wasn't sure he bought that explanation. Daniel sighed softly, his eyes avoiding Ben's for a second before looking directly at him again. "Okay, maybe that's not the whole reason." Ben crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe, trying to hide his smile. "So, what's the real reason?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. A moment of silence passed, broken only by their quiet breathing. Then he shrugged slightly. "I don't know, maybe I just wanted to see you again." The simple statement left Ben unsure how to respond. Part of him wanted to ask Daniel why a police officer was drawn to an unofficial meeting like this. Why there was such a strange attraction between them. But instead of asking, he opened the door wider. "Well, come on in." Daniel stepped inside, this time without the careful observation of the previous visit. He was more relaxed, walking closer to the kitchen counter, his eyes lingering on the half-finished cup of coffee. "Another late night working?" Ben nodded, sitting down in the chair across from him. "Comes with the job. What about you? Not on duty tonight?" Daniel shook his head. "Just got off shift. Not even sure why I'm ending my night here. But, I guess I didn't want to go home right away." Ben was silent for a moment before replying. "So, this is the first time a security check has extended past work hours?" Daniel chuckled, his eyes sparkling with amusement. "Maybe. I guess I'm not much of a by-the-book kind of guy." "I guessed as much," Ben replied softly, a fleeting smile crossing his face. They sat there, the conversation flowing more easily than before. No more probing questions or tense implications, just two men, each drawn to the other in a way they hadn't fully acknowledged. A while later, as the silence between them stretched on a little longer than usual, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying Ben. "What do you think about boundaries?" Ben frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel tilted his head, as if carefully considering each word before speaking. "There are boundaries between work and personal life. But sometimes, they're not as clear as we think." Ben sensed the meaning behind that statement, but he didn't rush to respond. He could feel the air in the room shifting. There was an underlying tension between them. Something was slowly reaching the edge of the unspoken. Daniel was the one who closed the distance first. He slowly stood up, moving a little closer, just enough to make Ben's heart beat faster. "I think I crossed a boundary tonight," Daniel said, his voice deeper. Ben took a deep breath, unsure whether he should stop things or let them continue to unfold. "Do you regret it?" Daniel looked directly into his eyes deep and searching, as if trying to find something in Ben's gaze. "No." Ben could feel Daniel's breath a little closer. A long silence, heavy with something they couldn't deny. Daniel wasn't rushing anything. He stood there, as if waiting for Ben to give a signal, a confirmation. And then, slowly but surely, Ben felt himself leaning forward, the distance between them gradually disappearing. And then, The moment arrived, a light touch. Brief, but enough to push everything past the limit. Their lips met in a quiet moment. Without any rush or pressure. It was a test, an exploration, but from the first second, Ben knew he didn't want to stop. Neither did Daniel. The initial touch became a real kiss. Slow but full of emotion. Nothing was said, but in that kiss, they understood that some boundaries needed to be broken, and they were willing to cross them together. After that night, everything changed. Daniel was no longer a stranger knocking on Ben's apartment in the middle of the night for some vague reason. He became a part of Ben's life, a part that neither of them had fully planned, but couldn't deny. Their meetings no longer had the air of coincidence. Daniel started showing up more often, sometimes right after his shift, sometimes just to have a cup of coffee in the early morning before Ben started a long day. They didn't say it out loud, but they both knew that this was no longer a normal relationship between two men who had happened to meet. Ben realized that he liked the feeling of having Daniel around, even if it was just the little things, like when Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, taking a sip of coffee that he had made, or when he tossed out a teasing comment about Ben's work. All of those things were becoming something he looked forward to each day. But things weren't always easy. Every time Daniel received a call from the police station, the atmosphere between them changed. He would glance at the phone, his face tensing, as if reminding himself of a different reality. And Ben knew that, no matter how hard they tried, they were still walking a fragile line. One late evening, when Daniel had just finished his shift, Ben received a text message. Outgoing mail, can I see you? Need to talk. Ben's heart pounded. He immediately replied yes, but the feeling of unease didn't leave. When Daniel walked into the apartment, he looked exhausted. Gone was the teasing smirk. Gone was the confident glint in his eyes. Instead, Ben saw a man struggling with something heavier than anything he had seen before. Daniel didn't say anything right away. He just walked over and hugged Ben tightly, as if he needed it to keep himself standing. Ben put his arms around him, feeling his breath heavier than usual. What's wrong? Ben asked, his voice gentle but unable to hide his worry. Daniel tightened his arms around him a little more before pulling back, his eyes meeting Ben's. I can't keep living like this. Ben felt a wave of anxiety rise in his chest. What do you mean? Daniel breathed out slowly, as if trying to organize his thoughts. I can't keep hiding. I can't keep pretending that this relationship doesn't matter. He stopped, his eyes full of conflict. But I don't know what to do either. My job, my family, everything is complicated. Ben nodded. He understood that, but what he didn't want was to see Daniel torture himself. Do you regret it? Ben asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Daniel shook his head immediately. No, but I'm scared. Scared this will affect my career. Scared that if someone finds out, I'll lose everything. Ben was silent for a moment before speaking. You don't have to face this alone. He put his hand on Daniel's, squeezing it gently. We can find a way. But if it's really what you want. Daniel stared at him, his eyes softening. I've never been more sure of anything. They spent the whole night talking about fears, expectations, the things that had never been said out loud. Daniel talked about the pressure from work, about how his environment wasn't really accepting of a relationship like this. He worried about the judgmental looks, about whether his colleagues would still trust him the same way. Ben didn't have perfect answers. He couldn't change the world right away. But he knew one thing. He didn't want to be a secret. You don't have to make everything public right away, Ben said, but I don't want to feel like a part of your life that you have to hide. Daniel gripped his hand tighter, his eyes full of emotion. I know, and I won't let that happen. Those words weren't an easy promise, but it was an affirmation. Daniel was willing to step toward Ben, even if the road ahead was difficult. After that night, they started finding ways to balance things. There were no sudden changes. Daniel still went to work every day, still keeping up a professional appearance when necessary. But in the evenings, when the door to Ben's apartment closed, he could let go. They weren't rushing, not trying to push things too fast. They found their own rhythm, text messages during the day, quick meetings, hugs that lasted longer than necessary. One evening, when Daniel was sitting on the sofa, his eyes full of thought, Ben asked softly, "Are you still worried?" Daniel looked at him, then smiled slightly. "Yes, but less than before, because I know I don't have to face it alone." Ben squeezed his hand gently, feeling a warmth spread in his chest. They didn't know what the future would hold. But one thing was certain, they wanted to face it together. And for Ben, that was enough. Things were slowly settling down between them. But that didn't mean all the worries had disappeared. Daniel continued to work, still carrying the responsibility of a police officer. Every time he left Ben's apartment in the early morning, there was still a hint of anxiety in his eyes. Not because he regretted anything, but because he knew that this relationship was still in a dangerous place. Ben noticed the change in Daniel. He tried to keep everything normal. But there were nights when he looked exhausted, as if he was carrying on an internal battle. Then one evening, when they were sitting together on the sofa, Daniel suddenly sighed, his eyes glued to the TV screen but his mind somewhere far away. "Can you tell me what's going on?" Ben asked, gently but firmly. Daniel smiled slightly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just thinking too much." "About what?" Daniel was silent for a moment, then finally spoke. "I know there will come a time when I have to choose. Ben, and I'm scared." Ben squeezed his hand. "Choose what?" "Between my job and this relationship." Daniel said softly, almost whispering. "I can't keep living in two different worlds. Sooner or later, someone will realize." That statement made Ben's heart clench. He had always known this would come, but hearing it directly from Daniel was a completely different feeling. Ben took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "So what do you think? What do you want to do?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know. I've been a cop for almost 10 years. It's my whole life. But you," he stopped, his eyes becoming softer. "You're the only thing that makes me feel like I have a purpose outside of work." Ben felt a wave of emotion surge, but he couldn't let himself get carried away by it. He knew Daniel needed an answer. Some clarity. "Daniel, I can't tell you what to choose. But I won't be a secret forever." Daniel looked at him, his eyes reflecting the internal struggle. "I don't want to lose you." "Then don't." They both fell silent. Finally, Daniel sighed, as if he had come to a conclusion. "I'm going to talk to my superiors." Ben blinked. "You mean?" Daniel nodded. This time his voice was more certain. "I'm not going to hide it anymore. I don't need to make it public to the whole world. But I'm not going to live in fear. I'm going to find out if there's a way to continue my job without having to hide us." Ben couldn't hide his smile. "Are you sure?" Daniel squeezed his hand tighter. "Never been more sure." Ben didn't know what would happen next. But as Daniel pulled him into a tight hug, he knew that they had crossed the boundary of fear, and that was already a victory. In the days that followed, Ben noticed a clear change in Daniel. He no longer had a restless air. No longer looked at his phone with a worried expression every time he received a message from his colleagues. Although he didn't know how things would turn out, one thing was certain: Daniel had decided not to hide anymore. One evening, when they were sitting on the balcony of Ben's apartment, Daniel spoke softly. "I talked to my superiors." Ben paused, his heart beating faster. "And?" Daniel turned to look at him, a soft smile forming on his lips. "Nothing too serious. They don't care about my personal life. As long as it doesn't affect my work." He took Ben's hand, squeezing it gently. "So, I guess we can stop worrying now." Ben felt a warmth spread in his chest. He didn't need grand promises. Just to know that Daniel had chosen him, and that was enough. They sat there, hand in hand, watching the city shine brightly below, not knowing what the future would bring, but knowing they would face it together.